All right, so we're about 2 minutes into our start time. So I'll go ahead and get us started here. Thank you everyone for joining us on our day 2, second workshop of the day. We're almost to the end, which is sad. It's been great. We've had a lot of great information, but it's not over yet. So here for our second workshop of the day is Heather Perry, who works with coordinated care of Apple Healthcare Connections. She's here to talk to us, inform us, impart knowledge about secondary traumatic stress and self-care today. Something I think we can all use right now in the midst of this pandemic and just in 2020 in general. So I'll pass it over to you, Heather, and everyone. Sorry, I muted myself. I'm going to mute everyone else. And then if Heather has a question, answer, response section, then I'll unmute and you'll have the opportunity to unmute yourself as well.
How do you got my tablet?
Is it charged?
95%.
All right, thank you so much, Essence. I sure appreciate it. There we go. Hopefully y'all can hear me now. Good. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Essence. I sure appreciate it. I wanted to just quickly let folks know, just in case you weren't aware, Coordinated Care actually has the contract in Washington State to be the health plan for our state's foster youth, which also includes alumni of foster care. They are eligible to be our members and continue coverage up until age 26. So part of our contract with the state includes no-cost community education, and I am actually part of that team. So if this is a topic, or if there's a topic relevant to child welfare that you are interested in having presented at another group that you're a part of, please feel free to reach out to us. My colleague Lindsay presented this morning on Medicaid, and that is our role in the community to facilitate information and discussion around topics that are relevant to the work that you all do. My background actually is not in Medicaid and healthcare. My background is actually in the child welfare system. I worked down in California first for about 10 years in residential treatment for young people and adults both. The young people I worked with primarily were part of the foster care system, but had landed in residential treatment for some treatment, and also worked with adults who had co-occurring mental health and substance use disorder, and many of the adults I worked with had their children removed, so some of our birth parents in many cases. And in the first 6 years I was in Washington State, I worked at a private agency in Seattle in their therapeutic foster care program. So child welfare and foster care is very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my experience today. And I also am hoping that many of you have had some introductory training on trauma, because learning about secondary trauma really builds on that. It sounds like there was a wonderful workshop just prior to this one. So we're going to talk a little bit about that too. Our discussion today is really going to be focused on the indirect trauma exposure that you all have access to, or that you all are exposed to through the work that you do. But I really want to preface our conversation too by just highlighting the fact that this year has been particularly stressful, right? We've got lots of additional layers of stress in addition to the work we typically do, in addition to the indirect trauma exposure that many of us experience in the workplace. 2020 has brought lots of additional layers of stress. So it's really a time when we need to focus on making sure that we are caring for ourselves in the process of caring for others. So just to start out, just some funny little comics to take a look at. On the left-hand side there, you see a bookstore, right? This is obviously pre-COVID, because we've got a whole crowd of people gathered around books at the bookstore. And as you can see, everybody is crowded over there next to the section for fixing others, right? Professional helpers, folks that get into the role professionally of helping others, right? We tend to jump on the opportunity to help others with whatever it is they're going through. And you see one lonely soul over there looking for a book on self-help, right? And it tends to be the case that when we get so involved in our professional lives, helping others, oftentimes we forget to focus on taking care of ourselves as well. Social workers, if any of you out there consider yourselves social workers, right, oftentimes need a larger than average stress ball, and that in general applies to all of us who are helping professionals. Your job is emotionally draining, right? You are helping other people deal with whatever is going on for them in their life. And oftentimes we end up empathizing, with what our clients have experienced, right? There's an empathetic nature to our job that makes us good at our work, but also puts us at a higher risk for enduring some of that secondary trauma or that indirect trauma exposure. So we're going to talk more about that today. And the other thing that we're going to talk a little bit about too is the risk for becoming triggered in your work based on your own history of traumatic experiences. So we also know that folks who get into the helping profession are more likely to have their own histories of trauma. They've been through their own experiences. And that puts us at risk for being triggered if we are working with a client or we are involved in a situation that is similar to something we might have gone through, or potentially, reminds us or triggers us about our past experience. So the reality is, right, we've all heard this. We've all been on an airplane at some point, most likely, right, and heard that we need to put our own oxygen mask on first. And if you're like me, I go, yeah, right? I'm a mom, I have kids of my own. And if I really sit down and think about it, I always think, would I actually be able to remember that in the moment? Would I be able to remember to, put my own mask on so that I can continue helping my children or helping those around me before I would jump to immediately trying to help my children or other people who needed care on the airplane? But really, when we look at what the research says that if we are in a position to care for those who have experienced trauma, we are going to be better equipped at our job. We're going to be better equipped in our role as a helping professional if we can keep our own stress hormones low. If we're keeping our own stress hormones low, that means that we are going to be more calm and we're going to be able to be more responsive in the work that we're doing. And those are criteria for doing the work that we're doing, for doing it well, right? We need to be calm and responsive to help facilitate healing for the folks that we're working with who have experienced trauma. So we really can't think of it as something that we have to remember to do or something that we have to tack on to the end of our to-do list. It really needs to be part of the work, understanding that we have to take care of ourselves. We have to keep our own stress hormone levels low in order to be effective in our role as helping professionals, in order to actually do the job that we are trying to do, in order to help facilitate healing. So what we're going to do today, first up, is take a look at some of the vocabulary, take a look at some of the language, make sure we have an understanding of what secondary traumatic stress is. We're going to take a little bit of look at the research. We're going to talk about different types of exposure. We're going to watch a video clip, and then we're going to end by talking about how do we be intentional about planning out our own self-care and planning out balance in our lives so that we are putting our own oxygen mask on first, right? So we can be more effective in the work that we're doing, more calm and responsive in our work with other people. So please do, as we're going through today, if you have a question or a thought or comment, please do type it in the chat box. I'm going to try and keep my eye on the chat box, and I'll try to answer questions as we go along. Essence is going to help me out with that just in case I miss one, but I do want to make sure that I'm answering questions, and I'll pause periodically and invite folks to ask them out loud in case that feels a little bit more comfortable for folks. All right. So by definition, secondary traumatic stress is really a situation in which you, the professional, have had indirect trauma exposure. So you haven't actually experienced the trauma yourself, but you've had indirect exposure through your professional work. And because of that indirect trauma exposure, you end up with some PTSD-related symptoms. So I want to ask folks to type in the chat, what are some PTSD-related symptoms? What are some things that you think of when you hear PTSD-related symptoms? Or you can just think about what are some symptoms of trauma? What are some of the things that we might expect or we might know or have learned about that somebody who has gone through direct trauma or has gone through primary trauma experience might be experiencing. I see in the chat box somebody said jumpy, right? So that might look like hyperarousal, right? Or quick to startle, right? Always on the lookout for danger. Absolutely. Yeah, hypervigilance I see. Anxiety, irritability, high sensitivity to situations and triggers, trouble sleeping, intrusive thoughts. Yes, right on, guys. You guys are doing great. Exactly, right? These are all the things that we talk about as trauma exposures from a primary trauma experience. Secondary trauma means we didn't go through the traumatic experience ourselves. However, we're still having some of those same symptoms because of that indirect trauma exposure. So we're going to talk a lot more about what that means and how that can happen today. Other terms that you may have heard besides secondary traumatic stress, or STS, might be compassion fatigue. We'll break that down too and talk about compassion satisfaction versus compassion fatigue. You might have also heard vicarious trauma, and you may have also heard the phrase burnout. Burnout tends to be one of the most common phrases that we hear, and burnout actually applies to all the professions out there, not just the helping professions. So that one tends to be the most commonly used phrase. So secondary trauma, and kind of thinking about that as an umbrella term, right? Secondary trauma can actually be, we can be exposed to that indirect trauma through a number of ways, right? So it might be what the client or the patient or the member that you're working with tells you or says in your presence. They might be sharing stories about their previous experience. Or it could be that you have a case file and you're reading through the case file and reading the history of what the individual has been through. It could be if you're working with young people or you're working with children, that you are observing traumatic play, or maybe you're reading stories that they've written or drawings or artwork that they've worked on. Or it could be just through managing those big behaviors sometimes that we see through trauma reminders, right? If the clients that we're working with are experiencing trauma reminders, that can cause really big, overwhelming emotions and behavior that's really hard to control as a trauma response. And so having exposure to that and working through some of those things with our clients can also be a risk factor for secondary traumatic stress. And then lastly, media coverage, right? Sometimes what's going on with our clients, what's going on in our professional lives hits the media too, right? So sometimes we're reading about it, or again, those case files as well. And then I mentioned it before, but I'm going to continue to mention it, right? In addition to the work that we're doing with our clients, we've got these additional external layers of stress too. We're right in the middle of a pandemic, and that also has an impact and an influence in increasing the risk for secondary trauma exposure. So hopefully this looks a little bit familiar to you. Exposure to secondary trauma can end up looking just like exposure to primary trauma, right? These are many of the things that you all mentioned in the chat box. So you might be experiencing avoidance or withdrawal, right? That's a survival strategy. When we go through something traumatic, when we go through something that's a threat to our safety, we are more likely to avoid it in the future. If this is your professional career, it might impact your effectiveness in the role that you're doing if you're numbing out, right, or becoming disconnected. Or it could be happening in your personal life as well, right, disconnecting from your family and friends. Or that hyperarousal, right? Some people said jumpy, right, or quick to startle. And that hyperarousal sometimes causes us to not be able to focus on what we're working on, right, not be able to focus on the task at hand. Re-experiencing might include nightmares or intrusive images, right? Or it could also be, triggered through a trauma reminder itself. And then lastly, thoughts and feelings, right? We might start to change our entire worldview once we start to get to a place where we have experienced lots of indirect trauma, or we've had lots of contact with clients who have been traumatized. Might start to feel hopeless, right? Or might even be angry about a lack of control over the situation or whatever our clients are bumping up against. So these definitions come straight from the ProQual website, and I'm going to share the ProQual with you all as a resource later. We're not going to actually complete it in our training today, but if you haven't heard of it, you can see down at the bottom of the slide there is the website, proqual.org, and the ProQual is the Professional Quality of Life Scale. So it's an assessment tool to check in and see how you are doing or where you rate in terms of compassion satisfaction, secondary trauma, and burnout. So these are as defined by ProQual. And compassion satisfaction is what we hope to have high levels of, right? These are the positive aspects of working as a helper. We want to have satisfaction in the work that we're doing. We want to feel like we're doing an effective job at helping others, right? And the work that we're doing is meaningful. When we have high compassion satisfaction, the good news is that that actually mitigates the impact of feeling some compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is burnout or secondary trauma, right? The negative aspects of working as a helper. So when we have high levels of compassion fatigue, that's going to impact our compassion satisfaction, right? So we can kind of think of the two as balancing or mitigating the impact. When we have high compassion fatigue, we want to have that impact mitigated by high compassion satisfaction. But when our compassion satisfaction starts to go down, then it definitely can be more of a risk factor for moving into secondary traumatic stress. It looks like I see a comment or two in the chat here. Okay, all right. So the ProQual is, the website is down there at the bottom, and it's actually in the references section of the slide deck, which you all are going to get via email after the training today. So you'll have those resources. ProQual also dives a little bit into work-related traumatic stress, and we're going to talk about this too. Work-related traumatic stress or organizational stress. We also experience additional layers of stress just from the working environment that we're in, right? Sometimes we're bumping up against systems. Sometimes we have traumatic events that happen in our workplace outside of our secondary exposure. And a good example of that right now is also the added layer of environmental stress, right? Of the pandemic that we're going through that is impacting our workplace as well. So warning signs for compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue might look like mental and physical exhaustion, using coping skills that aren't especially healthy choices, right? Like food or alcohol. It might look like disturbed sleep, feeling numb and distance from life, feeling less satisfied by your work, moodiness, irritability, physical complaints, right? So when we're actually getting to the level of secondary trauma, secondary traumatic stress, we're talking about actually having some of those PTSD-related symptoms. But compassion fatigue might not actually rise to the level of secondary trauma, but it can look a whole lot like burnout, right? It can look a whole lot like us not effective in the role that we are doing or not being effective in the role that we're doing. Like I mentioned before, burnout is another phrase that's probably more commonly accepted, and burnout actually applies to all the careers, not just the helping profession. So burnout is something that most of us can relate to, and it's very similar to that experience of having compassion fatigue, right? Emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, reduced feeling of personal accomplishment, like we are not effective in the work that we're doing. The last phrase for you all, just to have some awareness of, is vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is technically reserved for those who are in a clinical occupation. It actually is related to a clinical experience of a therapist who's providing some therapy or some clinical treatment to a client who has been exposed to trauma, but oftentimes it gets used outside of that particular context. So just to have some awareness around the language and know that when we're talking about these things, when we're talking about vicarious trauma, when we're talking about secondary traumatic stress, we're talking about that indirect trauma exposure, and the indirect trauma exposure itself starting to really impact the individual in a way as if they have had a primary traumatic experience. So it impacts us in a similar way. So I want to pause just for a moment and ask if there's any questions about any of the vocabulary that we've gone over, any of the phrases or the terminology that we use under the secondary trauma umbrella. Okay. Oh, able to talk a little bit about depersonalization. Yeah, let me go back just for a minute. Quickly I can, yeah. So depersonalization sort of is another way to think about that reduced feeling of personal accomplishment and sort of stepping back from the clients that you're working with. So almost like a withdrawal, right? But not feeling like you are really connected and attached to the work that you're doing. Hopefully that's helpful with that definition of depersonalization. Right, so it kind of goes right along in line with some of those withdrawal symptoms, withdrawing or numbing out from the experience that you're having. Yeah, good question. Okay, Patrick says not the dissociative aspect. Yeah, so it could be, you know, it could get to that level. when we're talking about dissociation, at that point, we're really rising to the level of secondary traumatic stress, right? Because that's a PTSD-related symptom. So when we're actually getting to that level, it's really taking a step above just having some compassion fatigue, Patrick. Yeah, great questions. Okay. So when the client's trauma becomes your own, right? So this is, again, that idea of that indirect trauma exposure, right? So you have not personally experienced the trauma, but you have been so involved in working with this client that you are deep into whatever their past trauma experience has been as well. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just to share a quick personal experience that I had. When I was still working direct service, I was doing some case management with a family, and I was working with an older adolescent in this particular family, and there was a biological baby that had recently been added to the family, but wasn't actually part of the family dynamic that I was working with. But long story short, I had also recently had my son, my firstborn. He is 8.5 years old now, so it gives you time frame of how long ago this was. And my son was actually just about the same age as this brand new baby that had just been born into this extended family. The unfortunate events that happened caused the death of the baby. And I had been close enough to this family and worked close enough with this family that this was a time that I actually started to experience some secondary trauma. I had made an association between my son and this new baby. They were just about the same age. I had met the baby. I had talked with the mom about where our kids were at developmentally, right? So I had already made an association and a connection between the two. And when I learned the news of the baby's tragic death, it impacted me. It impacted me on a deeper level than many of the indirect trauma, traumatic experiences had in the past. And I started having nightmares at night. I would, I had imagined what the crime scene looked like. I had read all the media reports. The person who was guilty had actually been on the run for a short time. They did end up catching the person. But I was reading the media reports. I was watching the news reports, right? I wanted to get my hands on all the details I could. I had envisioned what the crime scene looked like. And then I started having nightmares. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and in my nightmare, what I had envisioned the crime scene to be turned into my son's room, right? And in my nightmare, it was my son. And so I'd wake up in a cold sweat and I'd run into his room to check on him. And he was fine, of course, right? So I'd go lay back down in bed again and try to go back to sleep. And, 2 minutes later, I got to go check on him one more time just to make sure he's okay. So not only am I having nightmares, but now I'm not sleeping, right? And it's impacting my ability to be effective in my role because I'm spending my very tired, right, waking hours thinking about this case and reading all that I could about the media. And I don't know about you, but when I don't sleep, I'm also not at my personal best. So it was impacting my role as a helping professional. It was impacting my family life. It was impacting my ability to sleep. My husband noticed and he said, "Hey, I think you need to take a break. Let's go on a date night." And I said, "Heck no way am I going on a date night. Nobody's watching my son," right? Changes in worldview. I started to feel that I couldn't trust any adults out there with my child, right? Based on this indirect trauma exposure. So this was actually the first time in my career when fortunately somebody sort of tapped me on the shoulder, so to speak, and said, "Heather, I think you need to step back for a minute here. I think you need to get some clinical support." And I was so glad they did, because when I started to learn about what secondary trauma was and what the impact of secondary trauma exposure was, I started to realize that there were other times in my career previously when I had experienced secondary trauma, but I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know what it was called. And unfortunately, in the working environments that I had been in, I had come to the understanding that it was part of the work, right? This is just what you do. The work is hard and you have to plug through it. And sometimes it impacts you and you just have to keep going on. And it was the first time when I sort of shifted my thinking to an understanding that we have to balance the load, right? And that we do have a higher risk for indirect trauma exposure. And when it starts to impact us, it's a sign that we need to take a break. We need to put that oxygen mask on. We need to rely on our support system so that we can be our best self and we can re-enter the job that we're doing, ready to help out subsequent clients. So that's one way, right? It's the indirect exposure. The other thing that we are at risk for is having our own personal history of trauma triggered, right? Just like our clients sometimes have trauma reminders, things that remind them of previous traumatic experiences. You might be working with a client and the experience that that client is having or the history that they have might trigger your own history of trauma, right? So this is something else to be aware of. And as a helping professional, if you do have your own history of trauma, you need to be aware of what your personal triggers are. so that you can make an attempt to avoid them, or if you can't avoid them, so that you have a plan in place of how you get help and how you get support in the event that you do become triggered. Okay, we're going to look a little bit at, quickly, at some research. And they did a study in 2010 on nurses, right? Nurses are helping professionals. They wanted to know about what percentage were nurses experiencing compassion fatigue or burnout. And it turns out that in this study that they did, almost 36% of the nurses that they interviewed had scores consistent with burnout. I don't know if they gave them the ProQual. I'm guessing they did, because the ProQual assesses for burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress. About 27.3% reported compassion fatigue, and about 7% actually had some of those PTSD-related symptoms, right? So it actually rose to the level of secondary traumatic stress, like Patrick mentioned, might even have been dissociative, right? So looking at those numbers, what does that tell us? That tells us that, you know, about a third of our nurses out there in a non-pandemic year are likely to be experiencing burnout or compassion fatigue. It happens, right? If 1 in 3 nurses are regularly experiencing compassion fatigue or burnout, this is quite clearly a risk and a part of the job. So what we have to do is we have to recognize and understand that we have to prepare for it, right? We have to be proactive. We have to understand that the risk is high, and we have to set a plan in place to make sure that we are mitigating the impact of that stress, and that we've got a support system in place in the event that the stress load increases, right? So one way to think about this is, we know that we're in a profession where we're likely to have indirect trauma exposure. We know that we need to have a plan in place. But what happens when we have a year like 2020? Well, we've got a heavy load of additional stressors, right? A pandemic, a spotlight on systemic racism. We went through a whole season of horrible wildfires, right? Those additional layers increase our stress, right? So the likelihood is, if we revisited this study this year in 2020, the percentages would probably be a lot higher, because those additional layers of stress increase our compassion fatigue scores, increase our sense of burnout, because we've got all these other things to contend with in addition to the stress that we are experiencing from work. And then also just thinking about medical professionals in general, right? Many of them, I'm sure, this year at much higher rates are experiencing burnout and compassion fatigue. The other thing to know is that the high burnout and high compassion fatigue scores sort of predicted secondary trauma. So when you're already experiencing burnout or high levels of compassion fatigue, you're sort of headed down that trail, or headed down that path towards having some secondary trauma, or having some of those PTSD-like symptoms. And the other thing that's important to know is, again, thinking about the balance, right? So when we have higher levels of compassion satisfaction, those scores correlated with greater strengths of support, higher participation in exercise, use of meditation, positive coworker relationships, and ultimately the higher levels of compassion satisfaction mitigate the impact of that burnout or that compassion fatigue. So we need to be structuring ourselves and strategically positioning ourselves where we've got lots of supports in place, right? Where we're having high levels of compassion satisfaction, knowing that that's going to help mitigate the impact of the compassion fatigue or the secondary trauma that we're experiencing. Okay, another study that was done indicated that about 1 in 4 parents of children with a chronic illness met the criteria for post-traumatic stress diagnosis, right? So chronic illness isn't just medical, it's also behavioral. I think a lot about our caregivers and our foster parents, as well as those of us who are professional caregivers, right? If you're in a role where you're a professional caregiver, 1 in 4, that's about 25%, right, of caregivers who were taking care of a child that had an ongoing chronic illness, medical or behavioral, actually met the criteria for a post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're not just talking about symptoms related to PTSD, right? PTSD-like symptoms, but actually meeting diagnostic criteria. So it happens. It's part of the work. And we have to be prepared for it. We have to be proactive, right? Lastly here, there was a study that was done that indicated that traumatic stress sort of tends to infect or infiltrate the culture of a particular group. This is particularly important to understand when we're thinking about the workplace, when we're thinking about our organizational culture. I have definitely, in my past experience, been part of organizational cultures where you were supposed to just, you know, suck it up and get through it. And you don't need to take vacation days. Vacation days are for, you know, people who are weak, right? The more vacation days you have, the more of a badge of honor it is, because it means you're plugging through, right? Or I've taken the hardest cases and you know, that sort of a thing, like a one-up, right? Almost a bragging about how hard the work that you do is. I've been a part of that culture. And unfortunately, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about infiltrating the workplace culture or infecting the system, right? When one person starts to have experiences of secondary trauma, right, and it goes untreated or it's unsupported, it starts to impact that entire workplace culture or the entire group of that culture. So really what we need to be aware of and be intentional about is flipping it to the other direction, right? So that the culture of the workplace isn't one of traumatic stress, but instead the culture becomes one of co-care, right? One of reminding employees about self-care, looking in on each other, making sure that we're taking time off, making sure that we're using our vacation, making sure that we're supporting each other when we're working with a client, you know, that's got some particularly impactful trauma that you're helping them work through. And especially in a year like this year, right, when we've got all the external layers of trauma, we want to change the culture to one of co-care and one of self-care, and away from one where traumatic stress is the accepted component of the culture. So thinking a little bit more about organizational stress and trauma, the difference here, just to differentiate, by definition, a traumatic experience is something that threatens our safety, right? So we might experience organizational stress and it might lend itself to burnout and compassion fatigue, but it might not actually be a traumatic experience until it rises to the level of impacting your safety. Now, a layoff can be traumatic, even if you're not the one that's laid off. If your coworkers are laid off and you're scared that you might lose your job and you need that paycheck to meet your basic needs or to feed your kids, right? That's a threat to your safety. That can be traumatic. So types of organizational stress might include layoffs, mergers and acquisitions, violence in the workplace, empathetic nature of the work, natural disasters, right? Major reorganizations, turnover of senior leadership. These are things that happen within organizations. And so it's especially important within those organizations that we're placing some focus on creating a culture of co-care, creating a culture of support for each other. I see another question from Patrick in the chat box. Is there a tipping point? Should a percentage of workplace culture reach a sort of K where overt shared trauma stress leads to systemic failure? You know, I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't have any data or any research really to present for you around that. But I would imagine that absolutely there is, right? I mean, the culture of the workplace has a direct impact on employee productivity. And you know, studies show that when people feel greater levels of compassion fatigue and greater levels of burnout, they're less productive, staff turnover is higher, and ultimately from an organizational standpoint, when we're looking at having to hire people more often and productivity levels go down, it actually impacts the profit margin for the company, right? We're talking about money here ultimately for the company. So it's in the best interest of the organization to want to have employees who have high productivity levels and who are not going to be turning over or moving on to a new position very quickly, because in the long run, that's actually going to save the company money. So I don't have an answer for the tipping point, so to speak, but you know, one of the main or critical pieces for leadership to understand in terms of creating that culture of co-care is that in the long run, it actually benefits the employees and can impact the you know, the profit margin for that company or how well or how successful they're doing. Yeah, good questions, Patrick. Okay. So when we experience organizational stress or organizational trauma, right, it can happen in many ways, right? It can be direct or indirect, sudden or cumulative. Organizational trauma typically results in things that look like this, right? A breakdown in communication, a breakdown in trust between employees and between leadership and staff, a breakdown in productivity. There it is right there, right? Workers start to feel powerless, shake up in roles and responsibilities, a sense of loss, stress and contagion, and ultimately this leads to higher staff turnover, right? And that is costly for the company. So I want to ask you guys, what do you think? Understanding, right, that it needs to be part of the culture, understanding that we still have this responsibility to take care of ourselves, right, knowing that we're going to have indirect trauma exposure, who ultimately is responsible for your self-care? What do you guys think? I'll invite you to type in the chat. Who do you think is responsible for your self-care? I see ourselves. Yeah, Essence says you. Yeah. I see an us, right? I see an us in there. So yeah, many of you are answering you, right? And yes, ultimately the responsibility falls on us as individuals to take care of ourselves, to have a plan in place, to have a support system in place, to understand what our personal triggers are. But it's not solely our responsibility, right? And that's the idea of co-care. Co-care is supporting each other within the workplace. If you work in an environment, if you work in an organization where the job is to help other people, y'all are in the same role, right? You have the opportunity here to rely on each other. Just like it was a colleague of mine that said to me, hey, Heather, I think you need to take a break. I think you need to get some additional resources and support here. I think that you are losing your perspective, right? We have a responsibility to take care of each other because sometimes we don't see it, right? When we're in the middle of it, sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we don't see how much it's impacting us. So it's not just us, it's also our coworkers, and it's also our supervisors, right? Our organizational policies should reflect self-care and co-care, right? Our supervisors need to also be supportive. Our supervisors also need to recognize that they have an influence in building that culture of co-care and building that culture of support. Just like the organization leadership itself also has some responsibility in that. So yes, ultimately it's our responsibility, but there's other layers of it as well, right? We need to create cultures where we are taking care of each other. Okay, so managing personal stress, right? Again, the idea of using your peers. You know, we can rely on our family and friends to talk about our professional experiences, but ultimately, if they're not doing the same job that we are, it's our coworkers and our peers that are going to be able to probably support us in a different way. So I'm not saying one or the other, right? But both, right? Have a personal support system that you can rely on, but also think about within the workplace, right? Who are your peers within the workplace that can also help support you? Okay, and then there's some tips and some advice here around getting past secondary traumatic stress. And this might be using supervision, right? So reaching out to your supervisor, and this is a two-way street. This should be something that your supervisor should be offering and checking in with you, but also something that you can initiate or request as well. Increase your self-awareness, right? Part of attending this workshop is increasing your self-awareness, understanding what secondary trauma is, understanding you're at higher risk for it, and making a plan to mitigate the impact. We're going to talk after the video clip a little bit more about a healthy work-life balance. And we're going to talk about creating a self-care plan. Many organizations also have employee assistance programs, right? So that could also be something that you could utilize. But ultimately, right, we want to work towards creating that workplace culture of co-care, right? A focus on making sure that we are taking care of ourselves, we are using our vacation time, we are staying connected to the people that are important to us in our lives. Many of the things here on this slide for organizational stress are very similar, right? Using supervision, but also some other strategies around caseload balance, right? And one of the ways that you might balance a caseload is not just by, you know, thinking about the intensity of that caseload, but also remembering your own trauma reminders, your own trauma triggers, and making sure that you don't have too many cases or too many clients that are putting you at a higher risk for your own trauma reminder or your own trauma trigger. Right now, right, thinking about safety in the workplace is on all of our minds. And so that's something that actually can come from an organizational standpoint. Many of us are still working remotely as a way to keep each other safe. So we have to adapt in the midst of adversity, right? And incorporating training, right? Incorporating training is part of changing that culture as well. The assessment, right? The bullet up there that says ongoing assessment of staff risk and resiliency. Just like we know that the research around resilience factors, right, helps us heal from direct trauma exposure. The same research around resilience factors helps us heal from secondary trauma, right? So we need to know what are the things that we can do to heal ourselves from traumatic experience. And one of the main things that we know is attachment, right? Feeling connected, feeling like you're part of a group. And in the workplace environment, part of that is creating that culture of co-care. All right, we are to the point where we are going to watch a video clip. We are going to watch Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. She is actually local from Washington, and her book and the link to this video clip are both in the resources section of the PowerPoint. So I'm going to be streaming this for us today through our Zoom. In my experience, there is just a very, very small audio delay that sometimes you might experience through the content streaming. So if you are experiencing some of that today, I do apologize. Hopefully it's not too frustrating for you. I'm going to shift my audio, so it's coming through my computer here, so I actually won't be able to hear you all. So if you're having an issue or something during the video clip, please reach out via the chat box. And I'm going to go ahead and get us started here.
Years ago, I found myself standing on top of a very tall cliff, having what I would only come to recognize many years later as a near psychotic break. It would be fair for you to ask if I had always been that on edge, and the answer is no. But as many of you, I imagine, can relate to, how I found myself on top of that cliff on that particular day was by way of a very long road. Like so many others, my childhood was filled with a lot of love and many challenges. Life came into particularly sharp focus for me when I was 10 years old. My mom, who was the healthiest person any of us knew, went into a doctor's appointment for what everyone thought would be a diagnosis of pneumonia at the worst, and returned home having been told she had a very rare form of lung cancer. They gave her 3 months to live. She lived for 3 years, much of that time with one lung. And so she died when I was 13, and the sun rose and set with my mom, and I entered into my adolescence feeling if continuing to live wasn't going to be impossible, it was going to be highly improbable. So I navigated high school with a lot of overachieving. I spent my days getting straight A's and working 3 jobs, and I spent my nights planning on how I could end my life without causing my older brother, who'd always been my protector and my role model, too much pain. I did make it through high school, and then I landed in college, and I found myself sitting in one of those very large lecture halls, and my professor at the time, Professor Richard Applebaum, was talking to us about suffering on this one particular morning. In particular, he was talking about homelessness. And he was talking about it in a way that allowed time to stand still for me. He was building on what so many traditions have taught us for the beginning of time, really, that in life, it is said, there's equal measure of brutality and beauty, of pain and pleasure, of annihilating moments and of sublime moments. And yet there was a way he was talking about it, this whole conversation about equanimity, that was completely new to me. During those 3 years when my brother and I were taking care of our mom, we were surrounded by a number of very, very loving people and kind people who gave us a lot of support for appearing to be stoic, for seeming to be strong, and for holding it all together. And what Professor Applebaum was talking about on that morning is when one is engaged in suffering, there is so much more to it than holding it all together. So what I knew was I wanted more of whatever he had going on. So I went up to him after class, asked how I could help. He scribbled on a piece of paper the name and number of our local homeless shelter's director. And that's when I started volunteering at age 18, spending the nights regularly volunteering in a homeless shelter. I went on to work with all forms of trauma, and always within this kind of larger backdrop of systematic oppression and liberation theory. And what I knew was that I was so grateful that I had found something that made sense to me and that I felt passionate about. What I had no idea, and wouldn't know for years to come, was to what degree, having borne witness to the suffering of my mom and then the subsequent years of bearing witness to so much suffering with so many people, to what degree that was taking a toll on me. And this is something that wise people have passed down for a long time, and we know more and more about now because of the advances in neuroscience and the wonderful research that many of my esteemed colleagues are doing. But at the time, I had no idea about this cumulative toll. So one of the ways that the toll can show up is for those of you who are doing work. There are folks who do work, and as a result of the work you do, you might be exposed to things, either because of the content of what you're doing, but what a lot of my colleagues say is like, look, the work itself is the least of my concern. It's all my colleagues who put me over the edge, right? So sometimes the toll is because of the work. Sometimes the toll is because of the caretaking we do on our lives. Here she's saying, I feel like I need you less and less, Mom, now that I can make myself feel guilty all on my own. So much of the toll we feel is because many, many, many of you are caretaking in your personal lives. You're caretaking those around you. You're at home tending for folks who are returning from wars, folks who are ill, people who are in need in the community. Sometimes the toll we feel is because of the suffering of other living beings. This is Chris Jordan's wonderful work. And sometimes it's because of what's going on ecologically on the planet itself. This is the work of Vance Friedenberg. He's one of the leading scientists looking at the sixth mass extinction. But what we know is that when humans are exposed to suffering, hardship, crisis, trauma of humans, other living beings, or the planet itself, there's a cumulative toll. And there's a toll on us individually, there's a toll on your immediate relationships, there's a toll organizationally for those of you who have this exposure in your work, institutionally, systemically. We see it in movements we're a part of, we're seeing it throughout all of our communities and society as a whole. She's saying, speaking personally, I haven't had my day, and I've never met any dog who has. The other piece of this that's very important, at least when I do this work, is it's always held in a larger context of systematic oppression. You know this so well, but a reminder that the degree to which you're impacted by the lives you're living and the work you're doing is intimately tied to the fact that we're in a society with so much supremacy. And if we're in a society where there's no oppression, there's no racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, classism, and xenophobia, so much of the suffering we are tending to wouldn't exist, and the remaining bits that exist in life, we would all be affected by that so differently. I have no doubt that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day, and that for those of you who know what this toll is, and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face doing that, hey Laura, you're tripping, you should take some time off. And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. You know, survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was doing God's work. You could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not gonna have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my job. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted, I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised, we took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to other suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff, and would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You know, you kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation, because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately, it was my stepfather-in-law who said, are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you? And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, oh, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go to a playground. It's just a lovely place for children. You're not worried about like head injuries or Amber Alerts, right? So, but this is what happens, that over time, what you're exposed to affects your entire worldview. There's so many ways that we can be affected individually and collectively by exposure to vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. Many people call it many different things, but this exposure affects all of us so differently. What I have found through the privilege of getting to work with everyone from zookeepers to judges, school teachers to nurses, ecologists to activists, is that it is breathtaking, the commonalities of how one is affected, right? So some of the ways we find, you feel like you're not doing enough, right? So here they're saying we just haven't been flapping them hard enough. So this is where you feel like you're not doing enough. You constantly feel like you should be doing more, right? Another one could be morale. So they're saying, I see you've done time, so working in a cubicle shouldn't be a problem. So I work with organizations nationally, internationally, and one of the things we find so much is the morale, the very, very quickly eroding morale, right? Here he's saying, I bark at everything. You can't go wrong that way. So hypervigilance. Many people can relate to a sense of hypervigilance. This is where you lose your ability to flow in, really fluidly in between your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. You become in kind of in hyperarousal. I had a colleague say to me, she was a child support enforcement officer, and she said to me, I can tell you which ones of my son's friends are going to grow up to not pay their child support. And her son was 5 years old, right? Here he's saying, no, not there, please, that's where I'm going to put my head. So exhaustion is something many people can relate to, and not the exhaustion before you work out, but this is an exhaustion where you are tired in your soul, you are tired in your spirit, you are tired throughout your bone marrow. All of your ancestors were tired people, right? There's the avoidance. He's saying, no, Thursday's out, how about never? Is never good for you? This is where the best part of your day at work is where you don't have to do your job, right? And then there's the avoidance in our personal lives. She's saying, it's too late, Roger, they've seen us. Cynicism, many of you can relate to. They're saying, but she'll come down eventually, and she'll come down hard. So what many of you might be able to relate to is not the pure cynicism, but the cynical humor, right? And then anger and rage. He's saying it's a new antidepressant. Instead of swallowing it, you throw it at anyone who appears to be having a good time. And here he's saying, I can cure your back problem, but there's a risk you'll be left with nothing to talk about. So the other thing we see here is the externalizing that happens. When more and more people are asked to do more with fewer resources, we see this whole seduction to externalizing. So this is where you start saying to yourself, I would actually be fine taking care of my loved ones if I could have different loved ones to take care of. Or people say, I would love coming to my job every day if my immediate supervisor would just retire, right? And then there's blind spots that we have. So one of the things that we notice a lot that people have is blind spots. I'll share the story to illustrate it. This is a water bottle. It says the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. It's one of approximately, over 100 water bottles I have in my home that have been gifted to me like incredible programs that many of you are involved with, right? And every water bottle I have in my home has something stenciled on the side like this, which has, domestic violence, sexual assault, HIV/AIDS, infant mortality, flood, hurricane, tornado, tsunami, death, destruction, right? And I'm just thinking, this is great. I got water bottles. Every day is Earth Day here. This is fantastic. But what it also means is these are the water bottles that go with my kids to swim meets, basketball tournaments, soccer games, right? And I'm not thinking anything of it. But then I was unpacking my child's lunch some time ago, and I noticed that at school she found the provisions to kind of hack over the word sexual, right? So she's not exactly old enough to know what sexual violence is. She's definitely old enough to know you're not sitting at the lunch table at school with a water bottle that says domestic and sexual violence on it, right? I don't know why, but I decided to tell this story at a very large conference of police officers, and when the break came, a police officer came up to me 2 centimeters from my face, 20 bucks in her hand, and said, "Go get your kid a proper water bottle." So I feel like things have gone very wrong in life when you've got the cops giving you cash, instructing you on parenting, right? And then dogma and self-righteousness, okay? So here he's saying, your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country, and your mother doesn't. And then addictions, which many of us can relate to. She's saying, of course I drink during the day. I'm way too tired to drink at night. And numbing. So here he's saying, could we up the dosage? I still have feelings. One of the things I want to say to us about numbing, it is incredibly seductive with the volume and the intensity of suffering on the planet today. It is incredibly tempting and seductive to become numb. And what I want to offer to you is how critical it is that we continue to strive to cultivate our capacity to be present. One of the reasons we want so much to be present is we remind ourselves with everything that is out of our control every single day, one of the things that remains in our control at any given time is your ability to bring your exquisite quality of presence to what you are doing and to how you are being. That presence, we know, can interrupt the systematic oppression which is causing so much harm and can transform the trauma that is arising. It is very easy to get in that place of you have no idea what my life is. If you lived here, if you did my job, if you saw what I saw, and that's when we call on our ancestors, and that's when we call on so many people who have come before us who remind us that when they could not change anything external, they were able to shift everything as a result of where they put their focus. And again, I don't know any of you personally, but the assumption I'm going to make is none of us would go up against any of these folks, right? We're not going to, oh, Desmond, I know things got rough for you in South Africa, what with apartheid and all, but here in Washington State, we got a few things going on, right? Here he's saying, this is the barn where we keep our feelings. If a feeling comes to you, bring it here and lock it up. The other reason I want to bring us back to presence is I want to remind you that while I know we have so many different life circumstances, I believe we have a shared ethic of doing no harm. If you are numb, you will not be able to gauge whether or not you're doing harm. And if we believe in what Chief Sealth talks about with the web of life, or what Martin Luther King talked about with the single garment of destiny, you all know so well that there are so many parts of this web that are profoundly compromised. And many of you are bringing heart and soul to tremendous sacrifice to tend to parts of this web that are compromised. If the way you're doing that out there means in any way you are neglecting your immediate part of the web, cutting off circulation to your immediate part of the web, lighting your immediate part of the web on fire, it is not ethical practice, it's not integrity-based practice, it's not sustainable. The other piece with numbing out, and what we've learned from so many people who've come before us and in so many traditions, is you don't get to selectively numb. So if you're gonna numb out your sorrow, you're also gonna numb out any possible happiness you can have. If you are gonna numb out the heartbreak, you're gonna numb out any ability to survive, noticing what is beautiful. And the other thing is your mind and body and spirit will keep trying to bring itself back to a full range of feelings of that whole equanimity and that spaciousness. Which means that's why, you can work on coalition after coalition of peace building, and then you get in the lunch line or on the freeway and you don't let anybody merge in front of you, right? And we defend that. We say how I conduct myself on that freeway or when I'm getting my food at lunch has nothing to do with the other work I'm doing. Howard Thurman reminds us, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and then go and do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So we remember that with the magnitude of suffering at play on the planet right now, we are in desperate need of folks who have the wherewithal and who have the courage to be present. We know from that place of presence, it is possible to aspire to do no harm. It is possible to transform whatever trauma arises, and it is possible to continue to work to dismantle the systematic oppression which is causing such a legacy of suffering. From that place of presence, We know that it is possible to metabolize whatever arises in life, the waves of life, which will continue to present to us what they present. There is a way to metabolize that and integrate it so that over time you find that it contributes to your awakening. That the longer we get to walk on this planet, we find we have deeper compassion, vaster humility, and we are able to come up and out of the narrow places. And from that place of cultivated presence, we remember that it is possible to create and to sustain an ability to be truly transformative. Thank you.
All right, hopefully you enjoyed that clip from Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. I always enjoy hearing her talk. One of the things that you might have noticed at the end of her presentation that she talks about is this idea of metabolizing our trauma exposure, right? So just the same way that you might have done a cleanse at some point in your life, or we think about the toxins that we have exposure to or that we take in on a daily basis, we want to metabolize those out of our body. We need to have some awareness about the trauma exposure that we have and finding balance and finding a way to metabolize that trauma exposure out of our body. And the way that she talks about doing that is through the practice of self-care. Now we need to be aware, because when our trauma load goes up, right, when our exposure to traumatic experiences goes up, or when we've got additional layers, like the year 2020 and all the things happening for us, right, we have to be more intentional about working harder to metabolize that trauma exposure out of our body. And that is exactly what we do through practicing self-care. And so with that idea, we want to just really acknowledge that self-care is more than just a to-do list, right? It's not extra things that you have to do at the end of your day to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. We really want to think about it as awareness, right? So awareness of how much trauma exposure are you encountering in your daily life, right? So some awareness of the risk that poses as well, right? We want to think about it as balance as well, right? Balancing our compassion satisfaction with our compassion fatigue, balancing the trauma exposure with our intention around caring for ourselves. And then also making sure that co-care is part of the plan as well, right? That we're caring for each other. Because sometimes, like she mentions, we don't see it, right? Sometimes we have those blind spots. Sometimes we're in a little bit too deep. And then the main thing is having a plan, right? How are we going to manage the stress of the empathetic nature of the work that you are all doing? How are you going to balance that, right? This is a model from Dr. Dan Siegel. He is a child psychiatry professor down in Southern California. Some of you might be familiar with the hand model of the brain. He does lots of work around trauma and the impact of trauma to childhood development. But he also came up with this model that he calls the healthy mind platter. And the idea here is around achieving balance, right? Each of these elements are things that we need to be our best, to have optimal performance. And just the same way that we balance our plate in terms of nutrition, we need to balance activities during our day in order to be our best. So, you know, the analogy that's given is you could eat pizza for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day, week in and week out. You're going to be alive, but you're not going to be healthy. You're not going to be at your nutritional best. And so in order to balance our plate, we have to make sure that we're eating and we're getting nutrition from all the food groups, right? Don't forget the vegetables is kind of the thing that I think to myself in my head. So Dan Siegel's model includes each of these elements. Focus time. Focus time is time that we spend closely focusing on a task in a goal-oriented way. So for most of us, this is most of the time that we spend working is going to count as focus time. Playtime, on the other hand, is being spontaneous and creative, right? Having fun, enjoying life. Connecting time is connecting with other people. Now, ideally, this is in person, which is a whole lot more challenging in the middle of a pandemic, but we have adapted, right? Part of our resilience strategy is to adapt. We've adapted to virtual platforms so that we can still connect with each other. Physical time is when we move our bodies, right? Exercise, getting our endorphins going, right? Physically metabolizing some of that trauma and some of those toxins out of our body. Time in is quiet internal reflection, right? So time that we are spending just with our own thoughts, processing what's been happening during the day. I have to be honest to you all. Prior to COVID, my role was to be out in the community across the state of Washington, providing and facilitating training to folks. So I spent a lot of my time in the car. I spent a lot of my time in traffic. Never in 100 million years did I ever think that I would miss that time, because I actively complained about it. And what I've realized now in the midst of this pandemic is that a lot of that was my time in, right? After I had been to an event, after I had been working hard, that drive home gave me time to process. It gave me time to be alone with my thoughts. And I've had to be really intentional about finding time in, because when my work day is over, here I am, I'm in my house, I'm ready to switch to mom mode, I'm making dinner, I'm you know, making sure the kids have what they need, and I was skipping some of that time in, and it was impacting me. So now sometimes my husband gets home from work and I say, hey, I'm going for a drive to the store. He says, what are you getting? And I say, I don't know, but I'll figure it out when I get there. I just need some time in, right? Downtime is when we're not focused, right? There's not a specific goal. Maybe it's, you know, Netflix and chill. Maybe it's scrolling through social media, but time when we're just relaxing. And then last is sleep time, right? Our brain has to get physical rest. We have to sleep in order to consolidate and organize our memories. We have to sleep to recharge our batteries, right? To recover from the experiences that we've had during the day. So the idea here is not that there's a specific prescription that you have to spend a certain number of minutes doing each of these each day, but rather that we're including all of them, right? My plate was not balanced when I was missing the opportunity for time in, right? Maybe for some of us that are, you know, struggling with isolation right now, maybe what you're missing is playtime and connecting time, right? So think about, where are there areas of opportunity to increase each of these 7 strategies, and just be intentional about finding time within your day to do it, right? Don't forget the piece of broccoli. Don't forget the bite of vegetables. Like I always say to my kids, you have to have at least one vegetable with your dinner, right, for optimal nutrition. So think about what it is that you might be short on, and be intentional about finding time for each of these areas. And so with that intentionality comes making a plan. There are many, many, many self-care plan templates out there on Google. You can Google self-care template and hundreds of them will pop up. What you might find is that some resonate with you and some don't resonate with you, and that's okay, because we're all different. We're all human beings. This is one that you are welcome to use, and in fact, this is one of the handouts that I'm going to have Essence email out to everybody after the conference today. But the idea is that you can spend time thinking about what you do to care for yourself in each of these areas on the self-care wheel. So there's a section for physical, a section for psychological, a section for emotional, for spiritual, personal, and professional, right? How do you take care of yourself as a professional during your workday? How do you take care of yourself on a personal level? How do you take care of yourself in a spiritual way? How do we tend to our emotions? How do we care for our emotions? So I'd encourage you guys to spend some time thinking about actually creating a plan, and whether you're getting a pencil and paper and you're using a template and setting it down, you know, put it into your calendar, put it into your Outlook calendar, the time that you're going to spend taking a break, or the time that you're going to take exercising, or the time that you're going to take to, you know, connect with other people. I know one of the things that we're doing in our workplace right now, because we are all working virtually, we've lost a little bit of that sense of community and that sense of co-care. So we're challenging each other to check in on each other during the day, right? The challenge for the day is reach out to somebody you haven't talked to in a few days and ask them how they're doing, right? Connect with them for just a few minutes. So be intentional and create a plan for yourself. Write it down, put it on your calendar, right? Understand and accept that this is also part of your role as a helping professional, and find balance within that plan. Also in the slides that you guys are going to get is a link to the ProQual. So if you are interested in completing that assessment, there's a link right here to the ProQual. There's also a link to the self-care wheel, and then you can see the link right down here to the clip that we watched. The ProQual has a lot of good information in it as well, and the ProQual site actually has a lot of content. If any of you are interested in bringing this information back to your teams or back to your organization, there are actually slides on the ProQual site that you can just grab and use for a presentation talking about secondary trauma and how we care for ourselves. So we are just about out of time today, and I would like to ask now in the last few minutes if anybody has any questions or any comments. It looks like we've got about, 3 or 4 minutes left of our workshop session today. So I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions or comments. Carrie says, how do we get the slides with the links? And I was talking with the organizers at the beginning that said that it sounds like they'll be emailed out after. Essence, do you want to address that?
Accurate. Yes, we'll be emailing all slides as well as the handouts that Heather referenced.
Awesome. So you should keep an eye on your inbox for those afterwards. I believe it was also recorded, so I think the recording is going to be available to view afterwards as well. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your time and attention. If there aren't any questions, you can think about this as having, 3 minutes back to yourself, do some stretches, take a deep breath, do something, to just take a break from the screen for just a moment before you return